The seven wonders of the ancient world are incredible structures from the classical era. However, although 6 of these monuments have been located, one of them has never been found, and some argue that it could even be a fictional creation. But the lack of evidence related to the missing location could have a plausible explanation. Experts may finally have a clue in search for elusive seventh wonder of the ancient world. It was the Greek builder Philo who first devised his 7 things to be seen in about 225 BC. These days, we refer to these as the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They include the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the pyramids of Giza, and the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Over the years, Philo's compilation of his ancient wonders has been edited and refined to reflect different eras. However, his original 7 remains the defining selection. And each of them symbolizes feats of engineering and scale that would have been considered astonishing in their day. Sadly, however, only one of Philo's 7 wonders of the ancient world remains relatively unscathed today. Those are the pyramids of Giza, which have stood for more than 4,000 years. 5 of the others have since been destroyed, although there is enough archaeological data to corroborate their existence. But while 6 of the 7 wonders of the ancient world have been accounted for, whether standing or not, one has long eluded archaeologists. That mysterious site is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They are said to have been created by King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, who reigned from 605 to 561 BC. However, no actual evidence of the existence of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon has been found. For example, no remains have ever been found, and Babylonian records do not mention them. With that in mind, archaeologists know nothing about their possible whereabouts or what caused them to be included on Philo's list. Since the gardens were supposedly located in Babylon, Philo would have had to venture east to see them. The rest of his 7 wonders were found in or around the eastern regions of the Mediterranean, an area that was Greek or Hellenistic in its outlook and way of life. However, Babylon was not. Babylon was the capital of Babylon, a nation located in Mesopotamia. The remains of the city are now located inside Iraq. It was originally established as a port on the Euphrates River 4 millennia ago and subsequently became one of the most important metropolises of its time. Babylon's power increased during the rule of King Hammurabi, who reigned from 1792 to 1750 BC. Through his leadership, Babylon defeated neighboring states and eventually annexed a considerable part of Mesopotamia. And this state became known as Babylon. As the capital of Babylon, Babylon prospered. It became powerful and rich as a city and was filled with exquisite architecture. However, Babylon's rule did not last long. However, after Hammurabi's death, the empire imploded and for several centuries existed only as a small kingdom. Babylon then experienced a resurgence between 626 BC and 539 BC, when the Neo-Babylonian Empire emerged. This new dominion was the most powerful nation on the planet after defeating the Assyrians in 612 BC. But once again the empire did not last, and in 539 BC the forces of Persia led the fall of Babylon. As Babylon's influence waned, the epic architecture of its prosperous years became the stuff of legend. The so-called Tower of Babel, a structure built to reach the heavens, is even mentioned in the Bible. Other monuments such as the city walls and the Ishtar Gate are remembered to this day for their scale and beauty, respectively. Then, of course, there are the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which were immortalized by Philo in the 3rd century BC. He had arrived in the region a century after the Persians and Babylon were put down by the ancient kingdom of Macedonia under Alexander the Great. However, it is likely that the area and its architecture have remained unusual to Philo and his readers. According to Philo, the wonderful hanging gardens were suspended on wooden shafts that sat on stone pillars. The wood formed a trellis, which in turn contained carefully watered soils that were planted with an impressive selection of vegetation. Philo described the spectacle as a cultivation work suspended above the heads of the spectators. Alongside Philo's account of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, there are other Greek and Roman sources that paint the site in an equally tantalizing light. They often speak of dense vegetation that sits on terraces rising more than 70 feet. These plants were said to be in stark contrast to the gloomy appearance of most of Babylon at the time. According to these sources, the Hanging Gardens were an assault on the senses. They overwhelmed the eyes with their remarkable greenery, while the aromas of the flowers left a sweet-smelling perfume in the air. Furthermore, apart from plant life, the gardens were also said to be decorated with pillars and statues. So what was such a vision dedicated to? Well, according to legend, King Nebuchadnezzar II built the Hanging Gardens for his wife Ametis, as she missed the lush greenery of her native region of Media, which is today in Iran. But giving life to the arid desert landscape was not an easy task, especially in the 6th century BC. Researchers have speculated that to create the Hanging Gardens of Babylon in the way they have been described, an intricate watering process would have been required. Such an arrangement would have been a remarkable feat of engineering, using cisterns, water wheels and pumps to transport the waters of the Euphrates inland. However, despite the romantic story of Nebuchadnezzar II's display of love for his wife, there is still no solid evidence for the existence of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The many Greek and Roman references to the site were written hundreds of years after the site disappeared. And since then, archaeologists' searches to locate the gardens have proven fruitless. At the beginning of the 20th century, German researcher Robert Koldewey led the first archaeological excavations in the ancient city of Babylon. In fact, his team spent almost 2 decades trying to search for the Hanging Gardens. At one point, he thought he had found part of the Wonder irrigation complex. However, most experts now believe that the structure he discovered was likely a storage center. A decade after Koldewey's expedition, British historian Leonard Woolley claimed to have found evidence of the Hanging Gardens in Ur, a metropolis about 150 miles from Babylon. He believed that a series of openings at regular intervals in the brick he discovered could have been an indication of an irrigation scheme. However, it appears that, like Koldewey before him, Woolley mistakenly linked his discovery to the Hanging Gardens. The holes he believed were watering signs were probably created to allow the brick to dry evenly when the structure was built. So, once again, the wonder had eluded archaeologists. Given the lack of archaeological and documentary evidence associated with the Hanging Gardens, in recent years, researchers have begun to look at their problem from another angle. Perhaps the wonder has remained so elusive not because it did not exist, but because it was never in Babylon. Maybe it was located somewhere else. Dr. Stephanie Dawley is an honorary research fellow and fellow at the Oriental Institute at the University of Oxford in England. And she is among those experts who suspect that no one has unearthed remains of the Hanging Gardens in Babylon because they were built elsewhere. What's more, she described her reasoning in her 2013 book The Mystery of the Hanging Garden of Babylon, an elusive wonder of the world tract. The idea that the Hanging Gardens were not actually in Babylon is not so outrageous. That's because Greek and Roman sources often mixed stories from real life with those taken from myths. Furthermore, retellings of Mesopotamian history from that era regularly combine the two kingdoms of Babylon and Assyria. For example, the historian Diodorus claimed that the capital of the Assyrian Empire, Nineveh, was along the Euphrates River. However, it was actually located next to the Tigris River. Furthermore, in his description of the walls of Babylon, Diodorus described in detail a representation of Queen Semiramis with a spear. This has never been discovered in Babylon, but a similar scene is found on the wall of a palace in Nineveh. Given the tendency of Greco-Roman sources to mix up locations within Mesopotamia, then, it is not inconceivable that ancient scholars could also have mixed up the location of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And after nearly 20 years of researching the wonder, Dawley came to suspect that it was, in fact, in Nineveh. That's a few hundred miles north of the city they came to associate with. While Nebuchadnezzar II is credited with creating the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, Dawley suggested that it was actually an Assyrian ruler named Sennacherib who was responsible for the wonder. She claims that he built them in the 7th century BC. As a result, the gardens could also be 100 years older than previously thought. Researchers at the University of Oxford, where Dawley is based, reached this conclusion after making new translations of ancient inscriptions about Assyria. The engravings were, in fact, records of Sennacherib's rule, which occurred between 704 and 681 BC. On one of the stones, Sennacherib details the extensive monuments he erected. An inscription says, I raised the height of the surroundings of the palace so that it would be a wonder for all peoples, a high garden that imitated the Amanus mountains I arranged next to it with all kinds of aromatic plants. The description of Sennacherib's exuberant spectacle, of course, mirrors that of the Hanging Gardens. And although Greco-Roman sources suggest that Nebuchadnezzar designed his gardens to imitate the Persian landscape, Sennacherib's creation was inspired by Mount Amanus, which is now located in Turkey. Additionally, Sennacherib's government records also describe a screw designed to lift water, reminiscent of one developed 400 years later by Archimedes. In fact, the ruler was known for his innovative approach to technology. So, it may be that such an invention was used to water the king's great gardens. Furthermore, Sennacherib's translations were not the only evidence pointing towards Nineveh as the true location of the Hanging Gardens. An excavation in the city, which is located in Iraq near Mosul, uncovered an impressive aqueduct complex. And it dated back to the reign of the creative king. The aqueduct found in Nineveh was built from a couple million blocks of stone and transported water over the Jerwin Valley. Furthermore, an inscription on it read, "Sennacherib, king of the world over a great distance, I had a watercourse leading to the surroundings of Nineveh." Interestingly, an aqueduct is depicted in a relief made during the reign of Sennacherib's grandson Ashurbanipal. In the artwork, the watercourse provides a lush sloping garden with a pavilion at its top. Consequently, some experts believe it shows the famous Hanging Gardens, although not in Babylon. Another piece of evidence that seems to make Nineveh a more likely candidate as the location of the Hanging Gardens is the city's topography. The Assyrian capital is more mountainous than its Babylonian counterpart. As a result, raising water to the heights of the garden would have been much easier than on the flat terrain of Babylon. According to Dali, the source of the confusion over the location of the Hanging Gardens could be due to the fact that Babylon was invaded by the Assyrians in 689 BC. After that, Nineveh became known as New Babylon. In fact, the name was so common that King Sennacherib even gave the city gates the same name as those of Babylon. Furthermore, Dali believes that Alexander the Great may have seen the sophisticated aqueduct complex of Nineveh in 331 BC. See on his way to the battle at Gaugamela. She argues that her curiosity about the waterway could have sparked the story of the Hanging Gardens, which were later mistakenly said to be in Babylon. If Dali's claims that the Hanging Gardens were located in Nineveh are correct, he would dismiss rumors that the ancient wonder was simply a historical mirage. However, it would probably also indicate that a slight name change would be necessary. Babylon, of course, would no longer claim the site. Such a rewriting of the history books is sure to cause a stir. And Dali herself realized that her theory about the location of the Hanging Gardens would divide opinion among experts. However, at least for her, the paradise of Nineveh was largely a marvel in that it was magnificent in conception, spectacular in engineering, and brilliant in art. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.